So tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Sam Dagher to Politics and Prose. Dagher has reported in the Middle East for more than 15 years, including for the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and has covered the Iraq War and the Arab Spring uprisings. The Journal nominated Dagher's work from Syria for the Pulitzer Prize. In Assad, or We Burn the Country, Dagher tells the story of the Syrian civil war through the generational saga of the Assad and Tlass families. Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad wanted to crush the Arab Spring-inspired protests, while Manaf Tlass, Assad's friend and army commander, pushed for reconciliation. Now a defector from Assad's circle, Tlass, in exclusive interviews with Dagher, takes readers within the palace walls to reveal the family behind the destruction of a country, while Dagher draws from his first-hand experience as a reporter based in Damascus to show readers the chaos of an entire region, as well as its consequences abroad. Dr. Zahir Zolo, a Syrian-American doctor and president of Med Global, writes, "The Syrian uprising has been one of the most consequential events of our new century. It has changed the world." Dagher's book, told through the eyes of two important Syrian insiders, is a vivid description of the crisis as it unfolds over the past 8 years. It is a must-read for anyone who seeks to understand the complex world we are currently living in. Now, please join me in welcoming Sam Dagher.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you, everyone, for coming today. So I'm going to just say a few words about the book, and then I'll, make as much time as possible for questions. I think a lot of you have very important questions, and I want to have the opportunity to answer all of them tonight. Thank you. So thank you again for coming. So the book is really about how and why the Assad family has managed to remain in power for 50 years, albeit today battered and reigning over a fractured and destroyed country, relying on outside powers like Iran and Russia to hang on, but still there. I mean, we're still talking about him as the president of Syria. And this family has outlasted 8 U.S. presidents since Richard Nixon, so think about it. And the book attempts to answer why and how this family has managed to rule over this country for so long. And, as mentioned in the introduction, the book is a generational saga. It's the story of this family and its relationship with Syria, the country, the regime it constructed, and the people, Syrians, and the region and the outside world. On the regime side, we have the Assad and Tlass families, whose history has been intertwined since Hafez, the father of the current president, Bashar, met Mustafa, the father of Manaf Tlass, at the military academy in Homs in the early 1950s when they were in their 20s. They ruthlessly worked their way to the top, and when Hafez seized power in 1970 in a coup d'etat, his military academy friend, Mustafa, helped his friend crush all the challenges to the regime, be they from the population itself or at one point from Hafez's own brother, Rifat, as happened in 1984. And Mustafa's son, Manaf, was rising up in the ranks of the Republican Guard alongside Hafez's eldest son and the heir apparent at the time. His name is Basil. He's the eldest son. And when Basil died in a car crash, the Tlasses transferred their loyalty to Bashar, who was a shy eye doctor studying in London and who was, called back to Damascus to take the place of his brother as the heir. And when Hafez died in 2000, Mustafa Tlass, the patriarch in the Tlass family, took the lead role in orchestrating the transfer of power to Bashar. And the family remained loyal to the regime up until the uprising in 2011. In fact, they played a critical role in the first decade of Bashar's rule, helping Bashar project his regime as, a reformist, friendly to the West, opening up the country, liberalizing the economy. I mean, the picture that we see sometimes of Syria as this modern place, or the place that's modernizing under Bashar, and the Tlass family was critical in helping the regime project that image. And when the uprising starts in 2011, Manaf, Bashar's childhood friend, reaches a crossroad. Does he do exactly what his father did in the past? Crush the uprising, kill protesters, or does he maybe find another way? And you'll see that in the book, the decision he takes, which will have, an impact on him, his family, on Syria, on the regime. And as far as Bashar is concerned, he was determined not only to apply his father's manual in dealing with the protests, but he wanted to outdo his father because he was always seen as somebody who's weak in the shadow of his father. Maybe he's not strong as his father. So he was determined to not only use the same playbook his father used in the 70s and 80s, because the book goes into what, the regime did in the 70s and 80s when people rose up at the time. So Bashar was following the exact same playbook, and he gave the orders to shoot and kill protesters from the onset. Maybe not a lot of people know that, but I do have new revelations in the book that show that from the onset, the regime was determined to scare people off the streets. And I think we forget how things started because all the focus later became on, was turned to ISIS and what ISIS was doing, and we forgot how it all started in Syria. So I'll come to the photo in a second. But and so outside the regime, we have characters like Mazen Darwish, a human rights lawyer who had been working on reform since Bashar came to power in 2000. And he saw the Arab Spring and the tools of social media that people were using at the time, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, as a golden opportunity to accomplish what an older generation of opposition figures, failed to do. People like his father and other political figures, his mentors, who've tried to reform, but were always, reaching that block, that dead end. And like many Syrians in the beginning, he insisted on peaceful resistance. And I don't think that story is known enough particularly to a Western audience, which later focused on just the ISIS, which was more like a consequence of the conflict, not the root cause of the conflict. And outside the regime, outside the palace, there's a painter called Khalid al-Khani. He lost his father, childhood home, and neighborhood during Hafiz al-Assad's massacre in Hama in 1982. And I get into that in the book through the eyes of Khalid, who was 7 years old at the time. And the uprising in 2011 was also a moment of reckoning for him. Another character in the book is Sally Masalme, an 18-year-old from Dara. She also seizes the opportunity to find her voice and identity, ignoring her parents' warnings at the time about the consequences of challenging the regime. They kept telling her, we remember what Hafiz did to us in Hama, but obviously she wasn't born yet, and she was seeing the promise of the Arab Spring. One constant in this narrative, in the story, in the book, and both under Hafiz and under the son Bashar, is that the way they've distilled this lust to stay in power, this really desire to stay in power at any cost, into a precise playbook that they've used over and over again in dealing both with their own people and also with the outside world, with the US, with Europe. And it really, the title of the book is, and when we get the photo, you'll see it. It's basically the graffiti that there it is. So that's this photo I took in Homs in 2014 after Homs reverted to the regime forces, and this is in a neighborhood that was completely destroyed. So what the pro-Assad militiamen did is they went into all the apartments, they looted everything, down to the tiles, down to the copper wires in the walls, and then they set these apartments on fire to make sure nobody returns. And then they sprayed the graffiti on the wall, which says, "Long live Assad's Syria, Assad or we burn the country." That's what it says in Arabic, for those of you who read Arabic. So that's the title of the book. It's the regime's own graffiti. And it's also, I think, distills the mentality of this regime. Either they stay in power or the country is destroyed. And it's their motto. It's the way they deal with the outside world. Like at different junctures. You'll see it in the book, the way they deal with the Americans. Either the U.S. pledges not to threaten this regime in any way, or the regime will sponsor terrorism, will destabilize neighboring countries like Lebanon or Iraq. So it's always this, either we stay or violence, mayhem, destruction. And some of you will say, what's new? There are governments like this all over the world. And that what matters now is we defeated ISIS, we stemmed the tide of refugees, we don't have the scenes of them, drowning in the Mediterranean anymore, the scenes that we had in 2015. But I would say this thinking totally ignores the history of this family and the U.S. government's own dealings with this family, and you'll see that in the book, throughout the book, as well as the realities on the ground. I can get into that maybe through some of your questions. So what we've done, I think, so far in Syria is we've dealt with some of the consequences of the conflict. The consequences being, the rise of groups like ISIS, the refugee crisis. It's a result and consequence of the regime's desire to stay in power at any cost. But I don't think we've dealt with the root cause of the problem. So the problem is still there. Even the current U.S. policy, I know some of you maybe are following, that basically will sanction the regime, will sanction Iran, which is, a patron of the regime, and this will somehow compel them to carry out reforms or change their nature or maybe make Iran leave Syria. And I would say, again, this is not going to work because it ignores the West, America's own history with this regime and experience with this regime, and also the realities on the ground. So the root cause of the problem remains, and it still is today, the tyranny and oppression of this regime and many regimes like it in the region. Again, it's not unique, but maybe it's outdone the other regimes in the way it has survived and managed to survive, because the Assads came to power before Saddam Hussein, a decade before. And look where he is, and we're still talking about the Assads today. So it's been a decade since the Arab Spring started. Maybe for the West, for people here in America, for the Assad regime itself, for the other powers in the region that did everything to kill the Arab Spring, that for them maybe the Arab Spring is dead, it's over. But it's not the case for the people of the region. I mean, there are many people who are still hoping and dreaming of change. There are about 6 million Syrian refugees scattered all over the region, mainly in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and also in Europe. And Germany has about 1 million. Many of these people won't go back as long as the regime is in power. I mean, that's a fact. And maybe there are some Syrians amongst us today who can attest to that. And also the events the recent events in Algeria and Sudan are proof that the aspirations of the people are still there. People rose up in Algeria, Sudan to try to change the regimes there. And also even in Iran itself, in Saudi Arabia itself, I mean, we're still seeing a hunger for change, for a different future, particularly, by the young people in these countries. So I would say the struggle is not over, and at least for the people of the region. And with that, I'm happy to take all your questions. Thank you.
If anyone has a question, just raise your hand.
Hi, I'm Ayara Asmar, and I come from Lebanon. I worked a lot with Syrians throughout these years. I work for a German political foundation, and one of the most impressing things that I worked with is the Syrian media that grew exponentially during in the year 2015. In 2015, we were able to count and basically physically see more than 300 media outlets were operating in Gaziantep and Turkey, and even from Lebanon and even from Europe. And these media outlets are by now very much sustainable, and this would it's an indication of the future of Syria, even if, and not even if, since Bashar al-Assad is staying in power. It means that, and this is not a question, just a comment, it means that democracy will be introduced in Syria from outside, from the Syrian diaspora that is living outside Syria. And the amount of intellectual production that is being produced is amazing, and the professionalism of the articles, the briefs, the news briefs, the investigative reports is really high. Like it's a high level of professionalism. You would be shocked, since like a country in this country only like state media was running.
Absolutely.
Like we did this study about the quality of work that has been done. And you can see that people are not blinded by either the opposition or opposition's claims or by the regime claims. Some people are seeing the true story inside Syria, and they're trying to reflect it. The question is about the sustainability and how many like media outlets will be able to survive. But so far, the way they're dealing, and a lot of them have already built their own business model. I think Syria, if change will happen in Syria, it will come from outside, and it will come from journalists and media. That's it.
100% agree with you. Thank you. Thank you for that intervention. And I would just say people are really hungry to find their voices and identities. And I think that's at the core of the Arab Spring, whether it's in Syria, Libya, Bahrain. Let's not forget, in Bahrain, people were protesting before the protests were crushed by Saudi troops. And the same in many other countries. There's such hunger, particularly by the youth, to find their voices, to find their identities, which have always been defined by these oppressive regimes. And thank you for reminding us of that.
Hi, I'm Greg. Thanks for coming. I guess two-part question, just quick, your biographical background on how you got so involved in the Syrian region. And you've obviously told an important story. You look at that picture, and that should not be happening anywhere in the world as far as I'm concerned. So the second part is you touched on kind of the hunger within the country. What recommendations do you have for U.S. foreign policy on how we can speed up that process, or if we just should stay out of the region and let it unfold naturally? What are your thoughts on sort of the interventionist or staying hands-off approach? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. In terms of my own experience with Syria and in Syria, I started my role as a reporter in the Middle East, covering the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which I, to this day, think was a catastrophe and a grave mistake, whose consequences are still reverberating until this day, and we're paying the price of that. So I'll come to that a bit later. So I was mainly covering Iraq and what was happening in Iraq, but I was always go to Syria. I started going to Syria in 2005. I backpacked through the country on buses, trains. I talked to people, and during my stay there, I sensed this hunger for something different, for a change. But then, the official media at the time kept telling them, look, you want change? Look at what's happening next door in Iraq. You want that same thing over here in Syria. So it was always, either or. And back to the regime's slogan, either you accept that we stay in power or the country, goes to hell, almost like Iraq. So that was like going through people's heads. And that was basically the crux of the conversation. With many Syrians, obviously, a lot of them won't tell you this right away. They have to trust you first, because you have to remember this is a police state where people are being watched and monitored. So once you develop that trust, people were sharing their thoughts and aspirations. But again, the message from the regime, like, don't dream about change. Don't think about change, because Iraq is an example of what would happen if you would embrace that change, which I think is the way that these regimes everywhere, not just in Syria, scare their populations and keep their control over their populations. I started covering Syria as a reporter. I mean, I continued to go to Syria after 2005, almost twice or three times a year. So I'm very, very familiar with the country, with the people, with the culture. I would tell you, Syrians are the most amazing people, resourceful, adaptable, generous, and these qualities have nothing to do with the regime. I mean, these are just the way Syrians are by nature. Put them anywhere, and you'll see them make something out of their situation. I started covering it at first, covering Syria from Lebanon at the end of 2011. It was already a war, a conflict. And I had the opportunity to go to the country in October of 2012. By then, Iran was very much involved in helping the regime. It was already a full-on war. You had, the lines were drawn in the sand. You had countries supporting the opposition with arms and money, like Qatar and Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And that's partly, I think, as a result of the U.S. approach in that situation, where the U.S. was saying, it was the Obama administration at the time saying, we don't want another Iraq. We don't want to get involved. So if these regional powers want change, to let them do it themselves. And we saw the consequences of the arming of these rebels, but all working according to the agendas of whoever was backing them at that time, be it the Qataris or the Saudis or the Turks. And then on the other side, you had, at first Iran and Hezbollah supporting the regime and doing everything, and obviously the political support that Russia was lending at the Security Council. And then I had the opportunity, starting in the end of 2012, to get a press card, to be able to be based there, to report from there. I was lucky. It was total luck, the way I got this press card, but it allowed me to stay in the country. There were other reporters, brave reporters, working in the country secretly, and amongst them, my colleague Russia in the back of the room. She was there reporting secretly from inside Damascus. But I was one reporting with my byline. I was at the time a staff reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and it wasn't easy. It was a difficult assignment. You were being watched the whole time. You were being monitored. The people you're meeting with, you're always thinking, am I endangering these people by meeting them? Is the regime going to come after them? Constant pressure, constant intimidation. But I stayed. I felt it was important to tell the story from inside. So I stayed almost until they kicked me out, and they did that in August 2014. And by then, all the focus was already on ISIS. So I've continued to follow Syria, write about Syria, mainly from outside. I managed to go to the northeast, which is now what we hear about mostly in the U.S., the Kurdish areas, very early on in 2014. I continue to write about Syria, mainly for the Atlantic. So that's about my sort of experience in Syria and with Syria. In terms of my recommendations, I'm definitely not for military intervention, because I saw that with my own eyes, what happened in Iraq and what a huge mistake that was. But I am for the U.S. speaking out about war crimes and atrocities that continue to take place till this day. I mean, just last month, the regime and the Russians were bombing hospitals in Idlib, collective punishment of populations just because there are a few terrorists there. Yes, there are terrorists, but there are also 4 million civilians living in this province, and they were just collectively punishing everyone and bombing hospitals using the coordinates that were given to them by the UN. The UN gave the Russians coordinates in order not to bomb the hospitals, so the Russians turned around and bombed the hospitals. And we didn't hear much protest from the U.S. government. Why? I don't know. So I think the U.S. needs to speak out more forcefully about these war crimes that continue to take place, and needs to actually come out with a clear position on holding all of those that committed war crimes in Syria, not only the regime, other actors have committed war crimes, accountable, and the U.S. needs to do that. The second thing is supporting the young people that we were just talking about, among the 6 million plus Syrians around the world. I mean, there's all these young people who are eager for change, and we need to support them. We need to help them fulfill their dream of going back to their home one day. I think we can do a lot on that front. And maybe also, I mean, sanctions is tricky, but if the U.S. can find a way to continue to pressure the regime and continue to pressure people around the regime, I think that would be a good thing as well.
2 questions for you. The first is the opposition, the fighters. Who are they comprised of? And the second one is there a underground pro-democratic, nonviolent movement in Syria now?
Thank you. Excellent questions. So in terms of the fighters, You have to remember, initially, it was peaceful protesters. People came out on the streets to protest peacefully. The regime's decision from the beginning, the family, Bashar, his brother, his cousins, was we need to shoot and kill people to show them the high price of defiance, of actually breaching that fear barrier and coming out and protesting. We need to actually demonstrate that. So initially, I would say for the most part, yes, you've had incidents here and there and people rising up and taking up weapons for almost, I would say, up until the fall. So the protest started in March of 2011. So up until the fall of 2011, it was largely peaceful and people were dying day after day after day. And obviously at that point, a lot of the rank and file in the army, particularly the soldiers and the junior officers who were mainly from the Sunni majority in the country. This is like the majority sect in Syria. We're seeing what was happening to their people in their towns and their villages who were being shot and killed by the regime. They defected. They left the army. So a lot of them at first joined these like ragtag rebel groups. I mean, just people who were just taking up arms to try to defend their neighborhoods. And then obviously some people in these neighborhoods also took up arms. People like, teachers, dentists, lawyers who maybe saw their brother or their best friend be killed in one of these protests. And obviously that made them want to take up arms. And by then, the regime wasn't just using, bullets to kill people. It was using tanks, and then it went up to airplanes and barrel bombs and more sophisticated waves and chemical weapons to gas people. And I think at that point, when it became an armed conflict, that's when you had, now I'm just talking about the fighters who were in the anti-regime camp. You had the agendas of all the countries I mentioned, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, who went in and basically wanted to control these fighters and say, you do as we want, and you follow our agenda, and here's money, here's arms. And I think that's the fatal mistake that the U.S. made, was like to just stand back and say, it's not our problem. Let these regional powers figure it out for themselves. And that was like fertile ground for all the extremist groups to rise up, like the Nusra Front, which is still in place now. And obviously ISIS, had the space and to grow. So all of that came out, during the armed phase of the conflict. And now, I mean, there isn't much left of this fighting force. Unfortunately, they're all now concentrated in the north west around Idlib and parts of Hama province. And many of them, I mean, obviously, maybe you've heard of the Free Syrian Army at the beginning. It was a lot of these defectors, but now it's mainly these groups that are beholden to Turkey in a lot of these places. Yes, there are some who are still trying to remain independent, but it's very difficult. And obviously, there are amongst these fighters groups that are classified terrorists right now, like the Nusra Front and others. In terms of your second question about the underground movement in the regime area, I would say the majority of the people are, in their heart of hearts, are against the regime, but they're totally demoralized. I mean, the way they look at it is the whole world almost wants Bashar to stay in power. Like, what are we to do? I mean, the way they see it, the perception of the average Syrian who's sitting in Damascus is the U.S. wants him to stay, the Europeans want him to stay, the Russians are defending him, the Iranians are defending him. Who are we to stand up to this regime? So again, people have just almost reconciled themselves to the realities. But there are reports maybe of rumblings of opposition in places like Dara in the south, where it all started, and now this area has reverted back to the regime, more like under Russian supervision. So I don't think the story's over yet, at least for the people of Syria.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and giving this talk. I had a question. In many other parts of the Middle East, we hear about the Muslim Brotherhood as a powerful opposition group. It's a Sunni organization. Where do you think it falls in the future of Syria or its present?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. I mean, as you know, the Muslim Brotherhood is a pan-Islamic, pan-Arab movement. It started in Egypt, and then there are branches all over the world, as far away as Indonesia, Malaysia. I mean, Turkey the current ruling party is almost an extension of that, and other places. I mean, in Syria, the Brotherhood were, from the beginning, the most organized. I'll say briefly what the situation under Hafiz, the father. Initially, there were like almost two thoughts within the Brotherhood at the time in the 70s. Do they follow the path of the Brotherhood in Egypt, which was opposing Gamal Abdel Nasser, the strong man at the time, through armed resistance, or do they try to peacefully ask for change within the regime and to try to fulfill their political aspirations in a peaceful way? And I think, and obviously, what happened in Syria in the 70s, the armed wing of the Brotherhood started insurgency against the regime. But it wasn't the only challenge that the regime was facing. It was a very it was not actually different from some of the militant groups that rose up after 2000. When the 2011 uprising started, it was an insurgent group, a militant wing of the Brotherhood called the Fighting Vanguard, and they're discussed in the book. And they started targeting people because of their sectarian affiliation, seeing the regime, as minority-led and targeting people from a certain minority. But it wasn't only the Brotherhood or the armed wing of the Brotherhood that was rising up to try to change things in Syria. There was also a wide movement at the time of peaceful protesters, doctors, lawyers, university students, professors who were asking for change. And just like what Bashar did, his father went after these people first and hardest. So he eliminated them and said, look, I'm only dealing with terrorists. And then it became easy for him to say, I'm fighting terrorists, because the only opponent he had at the time was the militant wing of the Brotherhood. I would say after the Hama massacre in 82, the Brotherhood was for all intents and purposes decimated in Syria. And a lot of Syrians also felt the Brotherhood used that situation or abandoned them. So it's a very conflicted and controversial period of Syrian history. Obviously, the Arab Spring and the start of the Arab Spring was seen by the Brotherhood as a golden opportunity to return to power. And we saw it in Egypt, what happened with Morsi, and in Syria and Libya and elsewhere. And Qatar and Turkey, who are big supporters, obviously Turkey being an extension of the Brotherhood, and Qatar being a patron of the Brotherhood, felt that the Arab Spring was an opportunity to bring Islamists to power in these countries. And then we saw what happened, in Syria with the Brotherhood. In terms of any role that they would play, I think definitely they're a force to be reckoned with. We can't just say, they're out and that's it. Or I don't support designating them just as a terrorist organization because of some of the militant tendencies within this group. They're one of the most established and organized political movements in the Middle East, and there has to be a way to include them in the future of the region, of Syria and other parts of the region.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's very interesting. I'm actually interested in I think I can speak high enough. So I'm interested in captivity narratives, and I wondered if during your Syrian captivity narratives, and I wonder if during your stay you got to meet any former activists who ended up in detention, and if yes, then how is their situation like in Syria today?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. One of the main characters in the book, the human rights lawyer Mazen Darwish, he was among the people insisting on peaceful resistance from the beginning in 2011. He was one of the co-founders, along with his colleague Razan Zaitouni, a lawyer, and others like them, who founded what was called the local coordination committees. These were like grassroots movement that were trying to use the tools of social media, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, to get the message across. Because again, you have to remember the regime controls the media landscape and wasn't allowing people to work freely. So the only way Syrians could get the message across was to use these social media tools, and also to document what the regime was doing to people, killing people on the streets. So, and these people were insisting from the beginning on peaceful resistance. And even that was one of the main, I would say, cleavages within the opposition. Who in the opposition wanted to continue to resist peacefully, and who in the opposition was, wanted to take up arms. And even, in the book, you'll see in Mazen's own group were being approached by representatives of Qatar saying that, oh, this peaceful resistance of yours is futile. This regime will only fall through armed resistance. And people like Mazen saying, no, we're committed to peaceful resistance till the end. And you'll see he was, among the first to be taken out of the picture. They raided their offices, Mazen's offices. They arrested everyone, including Mazen, and they took them to prison. And he stayed in prison almost until 2015. And in the book, I show you the conditions in the prison through his eyes. And I think prison would be maybe too generous of a term to describe these places. I mean, they're torture dungeons. People are being tortured in the most horrific ways. And you'll see that in the book, some firsthand testimonies from Mazen, who is now, by the way, in Europe and trying to do what he was doing in Syria. So he reestablished his group in Paris, and they also have an office in Berlin. And they're trying to work on supporting, the media, the new generation of Syrians who are like media savvy, and also to try to fight extremism in a lot of these narratives, and also to bring cases against regime figures implicated in war crimes.
Hi, congratulations first for your for having your book. And I actually have a question concerning the situation in Syria. And I know the situation in Syria is very, very complicated, especially with the integration of different countries in the world, the United States, Russia, and many others who defend the Syrian situation. But I can see that there is a degree of through which the situation is getting worse. It started just a bit worse, and it ended up being extremely worse. But when I do reconsider and think about the situation in Syria, I do see that one of the decisions that could be made at that time, in the very beginning, is that Bashar should quit his position as a president, but he didn't. It didn't happen, and I would like to know your opinion or your expectation about the situation. Do you think that at that time, if Bashar would quit his position as a president of Syria, would the situation would be better after? Means very different from what is happening now? And thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Certainly there were opportunities for him to reform at the beginning, to really implement reforms that would completely change the regime. But obviously, he knew the moment he gave an inch, that would be the end of his regime, because of the way this regime has been constructed, for 40 years, is, the police state and the oppressive organs that control the population. So the moment he reforms that system, it would be the end of the regime. So he knew that from the onset. In fact, in my book, you'll see the Europeans and the Americans, through their allies, Turkey and Qatar and others, were trying to convince him to make changes in the beginning, meaningful changes. And they were telling him, you don't have to go like the others. You don't have to go like Mubarak and bin Ali. You can make changes. But I think again, the stakes were so high because you had the regional powers who were seeing the Arab Spring as an existential threat. I mean, the main powers being, if I just narrow it down to Saudi Arabia on one hand and Iran, who were seeing these revolutions as really an existential threat to them. What if these revolutions succeed in the Arab world? It's going to be them. It's going to be the Saudi citizens asking for change. It's going to be the Iranian citizens. So from the get-go, I think these agendas were right there. And obviously the Russians and the Russian considerations and how Russia wanted to use the conflict and to project power, to say it's back. And so from the beginning, I think these complications were there. But I think if early on, particularly the moment like when Obama said in August 2011 that Bashar has to step down. I mean, if the U.S. backed that with concrete actions that would have maybe tried to negotiate an exit for him, I think maybe things would have turned out a bit differently. But again, from the beginning, the rationale of the regime was, if we give an inch, that's the end. I mean, just the way this regime is constructed.
I was really quite uplifted by your words that you said you believe the revolution is still going on. Because somebody who experienced it in the Maghreb from 2010 to 2015, not experienced, but was there, how would you react to the thesis that is put out is that the youth, those who managed to bring down these dictators, then just didn't have the political structures and the ability to follow through and create an alternative. And they were overtaken by the powers, as you mentioned, of Saudi, Iran, and to a certain extent Turkey, and the Brotherhood exploited the situation. Although I wouldn't paint, I don't get from your response that you don't paint the Brotherhood with one brush, because I think there's some pretty good sides to them too, say in Tunisia. But how would you respond to that criticism, that it was a groundswell of a revolution by liberals, youth, but it just didn't have the ability to organize itself politically? And then what gives you your optimism now that is still going on, if it's all outside? I think it's very well and good to say that revolutions can come from the outside, but if the inside is so demoralized, then what gives you the optimism there?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I totally agree with you. The youth, there was no experience of, all the people of Syria knew was this regime for now 50 years. It was, back then 40 years of the same regime. Even, to the point where school children, in the cards they give their mothers on Mother's Day, they have to write, long live, Assad. So, that's the kind of system you're dealing with. So all of a sudden, the floodgates open and it's overwhelming. Yes, people had no prior experience, but I think the hunger and the desire for change was there, but they were never given a chance. They had to deal with tanks and bullets from day one. And obviously they had to deal with the agendas of these other countries that are coming in and wanting to control the situation. And even, once they had an opportunity to have these zones that were free from the regime and which they called the liberated zones, even then they had no chance. Again, there was the desire and the will to organize themselves, and you'll see it in the book through the character Sally, the 18-year-old girl from Dara. Her whole family goes to Jordan, and she is the only a girl that returns back to Syria from Jordan to try to help to organize her community, with skills that she had acquired in some training somewhere, to help the children, to help manage the local, to help the local administrations that they had fashioned. But again, they're not given a chance. They have to worry about the barrel bombs that are raining on them day and night, and you'll see that in the book. So I don't think people were ever given a chance, had the opportunity to truly demonstrate what they're capable of doing, and I think they're capable of doing a lot. And there was an opportunity back in 2012 when there was talk of a safe haven in the north, where the regime wouldn't be allowed to bomb people indiscriminately. I think that could have been an opportunity for people to demonstrate what they're capable of doing. And what gives me optimism is again, the Syrians that I meet outside, mainly outside of Syria now, in places like Germany and Paris, here in DC. I mean, these people, I think, have a vision for a different Syria, and they still believe in that vision, and that gives me great optimism.
Hi there. Congratulations
Thank
on the
you.
book. It's a huge contribution. Following up on this discussion, I wanted to ask if the U.S. or a U.S.-led international force had established a no-fly zone, that would have presumably made a difference. I wanted to know if moving forward from that, this is obviously a very mismatched fight here. You have Assad, the might of the Russian army, Iran, Hezbollah, on the other side, nothing. And what you said earlier about the UN giving coordinates to bomb hospitals. So it leaves one feeling very hopeless. And do you think, though, if there is a stronger U.S. intervention, not in the style of Iraq, of course. Iraq, I think, was a very unique case. And, I don't think every country, we cannot hold policy choices around the neck of what happened with Iraq was a catastrophe. I agree with you. But, every country is so different. Do you feel that if there was a more robust U.S. intervention, a range of no-fly zone, perhaps providing some stronger support, things could turn around? This doesn't look like Assad will be going anywhere.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that question. And
it's a big moral dilemma, I know.
Absolutely.
It really makes you think.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the no-fly zone, I think it would have worked in 2012. I do feel it would have stemmed the tide of refugees, people fleeing. At least they would have had a safe haven inside the country to try to manage their affairs. I think it would have worked back then. I don't think it works now. It's far too complicated right now, because basically what you have is all these proxy wars that are being fought on Syrian soil. And the last thing everybody's thinking about is the interest of the Syrian people. I mean, that's like the last thing we talk about. Even in the way the U.S. approaches Syria right now, I mean, it's talking about Iran, getting Iran out of Syria and trying to pressure the regime to engage in a political process. And I don't think that's going to go anywhere, frankly. I think that's it.
This will be our final question.
Thank you. Questions. The first question that I have is, I always have to say before I say anything, I'm not from the United States, I'm from the Caribbean. And I say that simply because where you come from has a certain influence on the way you see the world and, the opinions that you have. The first question I would like to talk about is the Syrian, in essence, uprising coming out of the Arab Spring. What I really see as someone who comes from places that, although not the Caribbean, but, Africa and other places, you had the tremendous long anti-colonial struggle there. I have always seen the Arab Spring as a continuance of basically the anti-colonial struggle. And that it was repressed, for example, quite violently in Egypt. Yeah, okay, well, but there will be more Arab Springs. It might not be called Arab Spring, but the Arab Fall, Arab Winter. But there are more to come. So I would like to hear if when you spoke to people, if they saw this as a long-term process and not something that will be able to be solved very quickly. That's the first thing. The second issue is we have not talked about, and I find that very strange here, the relationship between, Syria for a long time under Hafez al-Assad was quite a significant, significant between brackets, counterbalance to Israel and what Israel was doing. The creating of the chaos in Syria is to a large extent helping what's going on. We see now with the Golan Heights, right? The Golan Heights has been, at least the United States has claimed the Golan Heights is now part of Israel, not the rest of Western Europe where I grew up. I don't think the rest of the world would tolerate that, and eventually I think something will have to be negotiated. The third point would be the ambiguity of the West towards overthrowing Sadat and placing trust on basically the new people who are rebelling. In the Caribbean, we have a great intellectual. His name is Jose Marti from Cuba, who stood for a very independent Cuba from the United States, right? A Cuba that would resist American dominance of Cuba. Could it be that one of the big problems that the West is facing is as these Syrian intellectuals and activists and academics are resisting, that the United States and Western Europe is quite afraid that if they were to take power in Syria, right, they would be in favor of not a Syria under their control, but a Syria that is independent and decides its own future and economic and social and political future and geopolitical future. And that this is one of the big problems that lead them to be quite ambivalent about backing them. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'll just zip through these very quickly. In terms of the Arab Spring, you had a question about the Arab Spring, and I think yes. I mean, all these movements are connected. What's happening? What happened in Eastern Europe? What's happening in Venezuela? I mean, again, maybe there are some disagreements about that, but in terms of the desire for change in Venezuela is real, and I think that's the spirit of the Arab Spring. What happened and continues to happen in Saudi Arabia, which doesn't receive much attention, the women who rose up to demand their basic rights, and look what happened to them in prison, tortured. That doesn't receive much attention. What happened recently in Sudan and the brave people of Sudan rising up and then again being met by brutal force and violence. What's happening in Algeria and the aspirations of people there. So I see it all connected, and I don't think that movement is over yet. We haven't seen the end of it. The people are still hungry for change, be it Syrians, Algerians, Saudis, Iranians. Everybody wants the same thing: a better future for themselves and their families. An opportunity to live in a free society. I mean, that's basically what they want. And all of that hasn't gone away. I mean, there may have been wars and conflicts and all of that, but that's part of the struggle as far as they're concerned, many of the people in these countries. In terms of Syria and Hafez being a counterbalance to Israel, I would disagree with you there a lot, because you'll see in the book, after the 73 war, the agreement that was brokered with the help of brokered by the U.S. between Israel and Syria at the time, which created that demilitarized zone between Syria and Israel. I mean, at the time, basically, it was a quid pro quo whereby the Hafez pretty much pledged not to ever attack Israel or do anything that would harm Israel, and the U.S. saying, in return for that, we will not do anything to harm your regime or threaten your regime. And we see that playing out in the book, and you'll see it. And in terms of also Israel to the present, the Israelis have come out openly and said, we have no problem at all with Bashar al-Assad staying in power. The only problem we have is if Iran is his guarantor, his protector, and not Russia. And at the start of the uprising, Bashar's own cousin gave an interview to the New York Times and said, we care about the security of Israel. We care about the stability of Israel. Don't do anything in Syria that would harm the stability of Israel. So I think things are really more nuanced than that. The regime has always used this lie that it's in the vanguard of the resistance against Israel in order to control its population. I mean, that's like part of the narrative and the story, the propaganda that the regime has always used. And you'll see that, in the book as well. In terms of the why the West is not backing opposition, is that the rebels because they fear that I think it's not exactly that. It's more, the West reached a point in Syria where it saw basically the choice between Bashar and ISIS. I mean, it basically was reduced to this almost binary, and the same with the Europeans. They saw either we stay with Bashar or it's going to be terrorists and refugees. And it's a very simplistic way of looking at it. And I think completely ignores the root causes of the problem. And I think that's why we are in the situation today, because Washington and all these European capitals have made a decision, oh, we'd rather live with this dictator and war criminal because the alternative is maybe ISIS or floods of refugees. So I think that's where we are now.
Very much.